You are now watching the Conversations on Sinology podcast, where China's past and present meet global curiosity. Join us as we explore Chinese language, literature, history, culture, economy, and ideas that have shaped one of the world's oldest traditions and play a powerful role in shaping today's world. Presented by the Montenegrin Sinology Development Council.
Welcome to Conversations on Sinology. We are joined today by Dr. Tomasz Ewertowski, a highly accomplished literary researcher and philologist with a strong interdisciplinary profile, currently based at Shanghai International Studies University, where he teaches Polish language, literature, and culture. He holds a PhD in humanities with a focus on Slavic literature 2013 and a habilitation 2023, both from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. His academic formation is notably interdisciplinary with graduate degrees in Polish philology, Serbian and Croatian philology, and philosophy, which is a foundation that deeply informs his comparative approach to research. Part of Dr. Ewertowski's scholarly journey has been driven by a fascination with travelogues and travel writing. In other words, how people experienced, described, and narrated foreign lands, particularly China's, from the early 18th to mid-20th century. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Tomasz Ewertowski to Conversations on Sinology. Dr. Ewertowski, thank you for joining us and welcome aboard.
It's really an honor for me to take part in this interview. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation.
Absolutely, you're very welcome. You have conducted research, very interesting research and teaching across Europe and Asia, from Poznań to Karaganda, from Zhaoqing to Beijing, exploring how individuals in motion, travelers, shape the way cultures understand each other. So your work is especially meaningful for us today as we focus on maritime encounters with China. We are looking at sailors, naval officers, and seafarers from Europe who arrived on China's shores in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Being from Kotor myself, Montenegro, a city which is historically tied to maritime navigation and global travel, I'm always intrigued in the Adriatic and East Asian connections by the maritime history in general, especially of the Adriatic. Some of these voices that you are talking about, that you have researched, offer rare insights into these connections with the Adriatic and East Asia, stories that echo the maritime legacy of my own home country. So, my first questions would be, in your research of travelers to China in the observed period, namely 1720 to 1949, you are bringing together an array of those voices. You have divided them by different roles that they had on their journeys. So, could you tell us which were they? In your research of travel writings, you highlighted that while many travelers to China arrived overland via Siberia, a significant number also came by sea through Indian Ocean routes, often aboard military or training vessels. You mention a range of fascinating figures whose travelogues include descriptions of these maritime journeys. So maybe I have given an introduction into my second questions regarding the maritime military maritime journeys, but who were these maritime travelers that you have included in your study in general? Were they primarily professional sailors, naval officers, or did they assume these roles temporarily as part of a broader career? That would be the essence of the questions. Would you say most of them identified first and foremost as travelers, or did the maritime roles come to define their identity? If it makes
Mhm.
sense to you. Maybe I have put many questions all at once, so
Well, I will try to
please.
answer them one by one, especially that they are linked. So
Yeah.
obviously, Poles and South Slavs traveled in China and to China in many different roles. And the largest group I single out in my research is very heterogeneous, and I called them refugees from revolutionary Russia. Because after the collapse of the Tsarist Empire during the First World War, a large number of Poles and South Slavs could not return to their homeland by going from Russia to the west. So they traveled to the east, crossing Siberia, Mongolia, China. So I would say that they arrived in China by land. However, then they took ships from Chinese ports or from Vladivostok mostly. So they represent maritime travelers, like incidental maritime travelers who traveled from East Asia to Europe, to the west. Then, like another large group were Catholic missionaries, mostly Polish, but of course they were also Croatian Catholic missionaries. Yet another interesting group were soldiers, and I'm talking about Catholic missionaries. Depending on the period and depending on the situation, some of them traveled overland, some of them traveled by ship. Then we have soldiers, and it's a particularly interesting group because Poland, Serbia, Montenegro, and actually all Slavs outside Russia were not they were not nations which had colonies. They were not colonial powers, and actually in some situations they were even not independent. They didn't have independent state themselves. But still, many Poles and South Slavs took part in military conflicts on China's soils, for example, during Russo-Japanese War or during Eight Nation intervention against Yihetuen movement. So they were fighting within ranks of Russian, French, or Austrian army. It's a very interesting phenomenon, I think. Then we can also single out diplomats, journalists, researchers, and last but not least, tourists. Because the second half of the 19th century was the period of the birth of the modern tourism, and here sea voyage was an essential element of the birth of the modern tourism in Asia. Like it's often said that in Europe, railway was a technology which created tourism. When we are talking about European tourism to Asia, it was a steamship which enabled it. And the last point which I would like to make here is the fact that during one trip, obviously a traveler could assume a few laws, and it's also important to have in mind that for some travelers, a law assumed during traveling was very different from their normal life. So for example, one of my favorite travelers, like Milutin Velimirovich, was trained as a doctor, but in Asia, he was a member of a trade mission. Like his travels in Asia had nothing in common with medicine. And there is also one interesting quotation in a travelogue written by Vlada Stanojevich, a Serbian doctor during the First World War. And he was He was a member of the first volunteer division formed in Russia to support Russian efforts on the Eastern Front. And after Tsarist Russia collapsed, then he was in the group of soldiers who had to travel via Siberia, northeast China to Vladivostok. Then they embarked ships and traveled all around Asia, visiting Shanghai, Singapore, Colombo, crossing Suez Canal, and so on. And he wrote that actually it was a very comfortable journey and a nice tourist activity. And for me, it's especially interesting that we have soldiers who are being transported from one front line to another, and within this framework, they have some tourist activity. So this is how I would like to answer your first question about different laws of travelers. And well, I already started answering the second questions because I mentioned that many of them traveled by sea. And you were asking about like their identity, their role as travelers. So I think we can divide maritime travelers into three groups. So first, simple passengers, like this Vlado whom I mentioned, and all those other people who traveled from Vladivostok to Europe. That for them, the voyage was just a passage. It wasn't, so they didn't identify as sailors, not at all. But still they wrote, at least some of them, wrote interestingly about sea travel because it was a long voyage, a few weeks.
Right.
So it was very different from a modern air travel when we got on the plane and after 10, 12 hours we are in another world. No, and like this sea voyage for them was different. And then the second group, the people who were not sailors, but professionals working on ships. And here we have, for example, Dr. Milan Jovanović, who was a ship doctor. There were also, for example, among Polish travelers, we have Florian Chłasko. And finally, the third group, not that large, but significant, professional sailors, naval officers, like Vlada Ivelić from Boka, or for example, a Paul Henryk Cywiński, who achieved a rank of vice admiral in the Russian Navy. Yeah, so those three groups, we have travelers who identified as maritime travelers, and we had travelers for whom it was just like passing through.
Right, that's very interesting. Quite an array of different voices and roles that the travelers have undertaken on their maritime routes to Asia. And let's thank you for that. That was very interesting to hear. And let's take the example of the 1934 to 1935 voyage of the Dar Pomorza, the Polish Naval Academy's training ship. You mention several crew members, Meissner, Kosko, Kuleshits, and Rokichinski, all writing about the same voyage, but in very different tones again. Could you tell us more about the differences between those accounts? What can we learn from this stereoscopic approach to travel writing? Different people observing the same journey from different perspectives. Among the maritime figures, you have mentioned Captain Vlado Ivelić.
Maybe I can
But
first.
we are going to go back to that later. Let's just first talk a little bit about this question that I have asked.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question because it's it's very interesting, and I really like this example of those four narratives written after this voyage of Dar Pomorza, because
That's the pronunciation, sorry.
they demonstrate very well how writers' habitus can impact travel writing, because all of them traveled on the same ship during the same voyage. They visited the same cities, but the narratives are very different. And for example, Kuleshits had literary ambitions. He was the author of short stories, and in his book we find references to other literary works and some long poetic passages about realities he encountered, and even kind of like quasi-philosophical deliberations. For example, he had some interesting thoughts about Chinese characters and their role in like intellectual formation of an individual. So it's like one example that. And then we have Lokiciński, who was a student. I don't remember now. I think he was 18 years old, then maybe even younger.
Oh, so young.
Yeah, very young. And he wrote a short book. And what like struck me in his book, it was that he judged other cultures in a very simplistic manner. It was like without any deeper reflection. And then when we people like Meissner and Kosko, who were officers, they had much greater experience. They also, well, I said that those four travelers, they visited the same cities, but actually officers and simple crew members had different activities in those cities. It's also important. But in case of Meissner and Kosko, we don't have such literary ambitions as in Kuleshit's case, but their judgments are much more mature than Lokiciński. And I will just give one example. In Shanghai, Lokiciński made a very simplistic remark about comparing the foreign concessions and the Chinese part of the city. So he said that it clearly shows how European civilization is better.
Right.
While when we are reading Meissner and Kosko, they were not only much more sympathetic towards the Chinese, but they also wrote about colonial exploitation. So like they clearly knew much more about life than Lokiciński, and it's visible in their narratives. It's visible in the way they perceived foreign reality. Yeah, so thank you for this question, because I think this is really, those four accounts, they can really demonstrate a lot how different habitus can impact a travel narrative.
That's quite an addition to this conversation. Thank you so much. And very interesting one indeed. And you have mentioned a few names prior to answering this question. Among the maritime figures, actually, from this area, who recorded their journeys, Captain Vlado Ivelić from Boka, Kotorska, from my hometown, Risan, holds a special place. In fact, the remains of historical palace that belonged to Ivelić family can be seen in Risan. Captain Vlado Ivelić lived from the 1855-1940, was one of the most distinguished maritime figures of Boka, of this part of the world, in the late 19th and early 20th century. He came from the esteemed noble family of Ivelić from Risan, originally from Herzegovina, known from its significant contribution to the maritime and public life of the region. As one of the last prominent Bokalian captains, Ivelić commanded both sailing ships and steamships, which is very interesting, leaving a lasting mark on the maritime history of this area. But what makes him particularly relevant for today's episode is that he was also a chronicle of his time, a witness to the great changes that shaped an entire era. His rich maritime experience was captured in his memoirs from a seafaring life, published in the early 1930s, which remains a valuable testimony to the life of sailors from Boka, Kotorska. So, would you say this is typical of professional sailors' memoirs? What distinguished them from other travel writings?
Yes, I would say that Ivelić memoir can be described as typical sailor's memoir. And this book is very different from other travelogues I'm familiar with. So it provides a concise account of his 50 years as a sailor, and the book has, if I'm not wrong, 200 pages. So we get four pages for a year. And he recounted sailing routes and interesting or dangerous situations on the ship and in ports. There is even one erotic scene in like somewhere in the Caribbean, if I'm not wrong. But it's sea lanes, situations on the ships, ports, and little attention he paid to the lands he visited. Well, it's a book about his sea life, not about
Right.
places he visited. So actually, when I was writing about like images of China in travel writings, his book was of limited use for me because, well, he made some remarks about the weather, like typhoons, monsoons, because it impacts sea voyages, and he commented about passengers aboard the ship. That's it. But when I was writing about the impact of means of transport on travel writing, yeah, then his book was very valuable.
I understand. Absolutely, and I understand. So it's quite a different type of travel writing, but still very, very valuable one. And Dr. Ewertowski, one of the fascinating figures in the corpus that you have explored is Milan Jovanović, widely known by his evocative nickname Morski, meaning the seafarer or of the sea, as I see it, as a perfect translation, and Bombayac, which means the Bombay man. From 1834, Jovanović was a Serbian physician, a doctor, member of Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts, a writer, national activist, and a world traveler, and also a travel writer. His life was defined by movement and curiosity and the quest to experience and narrate the wider world. Due to the frequent sea voyages, primarily as a ship's doctor for passenger routes heading east, including voyages to India and China, he earned his nickname and nicknames, to be correct, and developed a body of travel writing that stands as a rare window into the 19th century maritime travel from the Balkans. He spent a period of working aboard ships operated by Austrian Lloyd, which, with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1969 and the introduction of the Bombay Line, acquired an international dimension, which was followed by regular extension of services from Bombay to Ceylon, Calcutta, and Singapore, and in the 1880 to 81 to Hong Kong and Shanghai, which is interesting for our conversation. Firstly, allow me to ask, to which extent is it possible to follow the maritime trends of the analyzed period? And are the outcomes of the transition from sails to steam ships and the changes affecting, for example, maritime labor or some other aspects and overall traveler's experience traceable through Jovanović Ivelić we have already mentioned, and perhaps some other travelers' memoirs. Is it possible to find information and follow the passenger's transformation of experience with maritime lines, expansion, and different means of transport, for example? So on.
Yes, this is a fascinating question. So it's very, I will try to keep my answer relatively brief. So first, well, I already mentioned tourists. So like modern tourism was brought into Asia by steamships. Then in case of Jovanović, we had a lot of observations about life on the board of the ship, but also about labor movement. For example, he was observing Chinese laborers transported on ships. So it is also a valuable testimony for all those changes brought into global economy by this new way of traveling. However, I would like to I think that Ivelić offers us the most here.
Right.
Because he was a professional mariner, and during his long career, he switched from sailing ships to steamers. And his writings show that actually in the 19th century, steam power transformed reality, but for a long time, sails and steam coexisted. And I did some short research before our conversation. For example, in 1870s, still 2/3 of the tonnage of the British merchant fleet consisted of sailing ships. So still like majority of goods were transported by sailing ships. Another interesting fact is that the steamships needed a lot of coal, and this coal was transported by sailing ships. So this old type of transport was supporting the development of the new type of transport. And finally, another interesting fact that when we see photos of steamers from that period, they always had masts with sails too. So they were still using the power of the wind. Now, in case of Ivelić, what is particularly interesting that he stated that steamships are safer and far more comfortable. And in this way, he was trying to encourage youth towards maritime career. Like now it's safe, it's like a good way of a good path for a career. And also here the context of the publication of his book is important. It was in 1930s in Yugoslavia, and he was trying to encourage the formation of Yugoslavian seamanship. However, so he was prizing steamships that they are safer, more comfortable, but on the other hand, in other parts of his memoir, we clearly see that he liked sails. And what is important, when he was already serving as an officer, maybe not a captain, but maybe he was a captain even already. But I forgot now. In one period, being already on steamships, he invested money in sailing ships. In one place, if I'm not wrong, he even has the advancement of steamers that has led to the downfall of sailing. I think he's a little bit similar to Joseph Conrad.
Right.
And the last point I would like to make about Ivelić in this context, I really like one dialogue from his memoir. That he was talking with an old officer from another ship, and both of them had sailing experience, and they started complaining that in the past a crew of 10 people could operate a large seagoing vessel. But now those young sailors that they are different. And of course, it's like this example of old people complaining about young people. We know it has been going on since ancient Egypt, if I'm not wrong. But there is also another interesting point that we see how the development of technology promotes, we can call it de-skilling probably. That sailors trained on the steamers, they had less skills or maybe simply other skills than sailors trained on sailing ships. And I was thinking, of course, in the contemporary context about so-called artificial intelligence and large learning models, that how development of technology actually leads to the skilling. So I think that here Ivelić memoir offers a very interesting testimony.
Well, thank you for that. That was so interesting for me as a person from his hometown and also a researcher in the field of maritime affairs. Was so insightful. I hope it, and definitely, I'm sure it will be interesting for all those who will be watching. And thank you again. I would just like to go back a little bit to Milan Jovanović Morski and his contribution to travel writing. What was the particular style of his maritime narratives and how his position as both physician and voyager shaped his representation of the East? What place does he hold, in your opinion, within the travel literature of the Balkans, about China and Asia?
Thank you very much for this question, because Jovanović is one of my favorite travel writers. And I think that for understanding representations of China and generally Asia in South Slavic literatures, and especially in Serbian literature, Jovanović is absolutely a key writer. He wrote a coherent, extensive book-length narrative, which, as far as I know, before him, we cannot find many such narratives, if any. And he described not only his personal experiences, but he also created compelling images of cultural and political realities he encountered, well, not only in China, but also in India, in Southeast Asia, in Arabia. And besides that, he even offered some reflections on the philosophy of history. So he was like a writer of extensive intellectual horizons. Then what is also important, especially when we take into account the context in which he was writing, like second half, late 19th century, and writing in that period, he was very critical towards European imperialism and colonialism, and he idealized the Chinese. Okay. And before the 20th century, I'm not aware of at least of a Serbian travel book about Asia that can be compared with his work. And of course, if we judge him from our contemporary perspective, so some of his comments are quite weird. Some of them are actually racist even. But well, it's like our contemporary perspective, and he shouldn't be judged using our contemporary ideas. And it doesn't change the fact that he was an exceptional mind, curious about foreign reality, and a gifted writer, which is also important, that his writing was on a very high level. And what is like really what is also important, that in the 20th century he was largely forgotten. There is even an article from, I think, 1970s by Ivo Tartaglia entitled A Forgotten Master of Prose from the Realist Period. So then Jovanović was like this forgotten writer. But in recent years, maybe recent 20 years, there is a growing interest in him. because his writings really answers our contemporary interest in travel writing, intercultural encounters, and so on. And there is even a book-length biography about him, written by Snežana Berković. Yeah, so Jovanović is a very important writer, and I'm really glad that he's being read more often now.
Lastly, you include Anselm Dzwonkowski, a Polish sailor who didn't reach China itself, but interacted with Chinese communities in Indonesia in the late 18th century. Why is his text significant?
Mm, yeah, I think I can give three reasons why Dzwonkowski is significant. So firstly, there are not many Polish book-length narratives about maritime travels to Asia in the 18th century or earlier. So simply Dzwonkowski is valuable as a rare historical source. Then second issue is he exemplifies a very interesting phenomenon, namely Polish entanglement in European colonial history. So Dzwonkowski fought in an uprising against Russia, which led to the wiping out of Poland from the map. And then it's why he moved to the Netherlands and became a soldier on a ship, like traveling to Dutch colonies in nowadays Indonesia. So we have someone who is, I guess, stateless, who is not stateless, but someone who is from the state which ceased to exist, and a state which didn't have colonies at all. On the other hand, he still served in a colonial army, and he profited from it. And one of scholars who were analyzing Dzwonkowski's memoir wrote that Dzwonkowski demonstrated his name was Dariusz Kołodziejczyk. He was this scholar I'm quoting now. So according to him, Dzwonkowski demonstrated like flexible navigation between values, identities, and cultures. So he was a Polish nobleman, but when it was necessary, he served in foreign armies, and when he felt anti-Polish prejudice, he chose to pass as a Hungarian.
Yeah.
And finally, Dzwonkowski is simply interesting as a story. His narrative, although it was written 200 years ago, it's simply interesting to read as a piece of like literature about personal experience. And I need to make one clarification. So Dzwonkowski was not exactly a sailor. Like I mentioned, that there were those travelers who traveled on ships, but they were not sailors, but professionals working on a ship. So he would be in this group because he was a soldier employed to serve as at a Dutch ship.
Thank you so much for this clarification. It was very insightful. These are all the facts that certainly anyone who would try to learn more about the topic would definitely find the difficulty to find by himself or herself without your insights and your extensive research on the topic. So it's very useful.
Thank you for your kind words.
It is well deserved, and at the end, I must say that we have reached the end of this podcast episode. Dr. Ewertowski, thank you so much for guiding us through the lives and the writings of these extraordinary travelers. We mentioned sailors, officers, doctors, adventurers, whose journeys to China remind us how mobility, identity, and storytelling intertwine. From impressions of ports to detailed naval memoirs, each one of these accounts adds another layer to the mosaic of how China was seen in the past, experienced and imagined in the 19th and early 20th centuries. For me, I will say it again at the end, coming from Boka, Kotorska, a city with long seafaring tradition, this discussion resonates deeply, and it shows actually how maritime encounters not only connected continents but also shaped perceptions, friendships, and sometimes even entire worldviews. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this voyage through travelogues and maritime histories. Until next time on Conversations on Sinology, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember that every journey, whether across oceans or across pages, carries the potential to reshape how we see the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for your insightful questions. And I'm also expressing my thanks to all listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.